And for me, these three guys stood out to me this week. I think mostly because I tend to dismiss them as just sort of characters in Jesus' main story, or there's got to be a dark so that there can be a light, and there's always these bad guys so that there can be good guys. But these three have stood out to me in these last couple of weeks. Each one of them refused to abandon their quest for control and surrender to the Savior of the world. And I asked myself this morning, how am I maybe just a little bit like them? How am I a little bit like them? How can I avoid the mistakes that they made? You see, for each one of them, it boiled down to really a matter of trust in God and in his plan and in his journey. And we would say that these men are some of the bad boys of the Bible, but I'm not so sure that they're not just a little bit like you and like me. You see, we Christians, we often resist the God that we say we trust. We often resist the God that we say we trust. Some of us resist inviting him into our lives altogether. We've just kind of held God at bay. Other times, we resist really giving him control completely, really trusting him completely. Oh, I know that, Lord, I've invited you in my heart, and you said that I should forgive this person for doing that to me, but I'm reserving the right to hold my anger and my bitterness. Because if you knew what they did, right? You know you should be more generous or more giving, but it's hard. Things are tight. Money's tight. You know you should get out of that bad relationship. You know that your mom and your dad and your grandma and your teacher and everybody else said that was not the one for you. But yet you jumped in, followed your whatever, and here we are stuck in this relationship that's going nowhere. And the Lord is saying to you in your quiet moments of prayer, this is not the right way for you. But you know that God is calling you to do this or to choose that. You know that God is asking you to serve your neighbor or love that person at work who's, oh my Lord, if you knew my boss, God, this whole loving everybody thing, there would have been caveats, right? See, we'll wave our palm branches and we'll shout our hosannas on the day that we invite him into our heart and trust him. But when he prompts us to live according to his word or the way that the Holy Spirit moves or we're called to obey him, we set him aside like the crowd did and we put him away. There's a word for that. It's a word that we don't like as Christians, but come on, let's just own it. It's called hypocrisy. And quite frankly, I'm guilty. I mean, I don't know about you. I know this is news to you. You do not have a perfect pastor. He's not a perfect man. And I'm guessing that if I ask that question that pastors will often ask, raise your hand if, I'm guessing I'm not the only one in the room who's not perfect. You see, we resist the God we say and claim that we trust. But let's give us some grace. It's hard. I don't know about you, but loving my neighbors, sometimes loving my family. Oh man, there are some people in my family. It is hard. Living the way this Bible tells me to live is hard. Being generous at times is hard. Oh, it looks good on paper, and I like to say that I do all these things for my community until the phone rings, and then it's just hard, right? It's hard. So we're looking at three characters this morning who struggled with, who struggled with Jesus in his final days. They had specific agendas or plans for their own lives, and their agendas put them at odds with Jesus and his agenda. Three bad boys. But like I said, I'm guessing these guys got a little bit of a bad rap. I think we're probably a little more like them than we care to admit. I'm not so sure that if we weren't in their exact shoes, we wouldn't have made the same choices they made. In fact, I'm not so sure that we still don't make some of those choices today. This first one is Caiaphas. Caiaphas is a Jewish high priest. Now, the thing about Caiaphas is, as the Jewish high priest, he represented the church of Israel to all of Rome. And likely more importantly, he actually represented Rome to the church of Israel. He's the most powerful and influential church leader and one of the most powerful men in general in all of Israel. He was the main connecting point between the nation of Israel and Rome and their empire. Caiaphas was part of a family, get this, he was part of a family that controlled the temple which meant he controlled the power, the politics, the religion, and the money for more than 40 years. His father-in-law was a high priest. 5 of his brothers-in-law were high priests. Caiaphas' family was in power and in wealth for more than 4 decades. They had a plan. Things were absolutely great in Caiaphas' world. Okay? I mean, just think about this. When you consider the temple tax that was levied on people in that day, as well as all the other perks that came with being an authority and control over the 32 acres that was this temple epicenter of all, there's a lot of power and a lot of authority and a lot of wealth that runs with that. Yeah, things were great in Caiaphas' world. Things were really great in Caiaphas' world until this carpenter came along. This Jesus of Nazareth showed up. What was the church's problem with Jesus? Well, whether it was the high priests or the Sanhedrin or the Pharisees, it wasn't Jesus' teaching that threatened them. And I really want to be clear about this. It wasn't because he taught a different way. There were a lot of false teachers in that area, and a lot of false teachers at that time. What threatened the leaders, the religious leaders, were the crowds. People were following Jesus. He wasn't just preaching on a street corner and going to bed at night. People were following. In fact, the crowds were growing. And when you control the crowd, you control people. And when you control people, you are in power. And they liked their control and their power. And Jesus was turning the crowds. That was the threat. And as Jesus' crowds began to grow, it threatened their control. It was all about the power. And they had been watching his crowds grow with great concern. In fact, the straw that kind of broke the camel's back was really just a day or two before Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And it's when Jesus performed this massive miracle that everybody knew about and heard about. He actually raised the dead. You remember, he raised Lazarus the day before he rode into Jerusalem. And at that time, the crowds that was it. That burst the bubble. The crowds just grew. And that was it for the religious leaders. When that happened, the crowds grew greater. Would you stand with me and honor the first reading of the word this morning? I'm going to read in John chapter 11, verses 45 to 50, 53, and then 55 through 57. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is the man performing all these signs, and if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. I want you to catch these words. First of all, many people, many of the Jews came. The crowds were growing. And what was their concern? Not that he was performing miracles, but that if he does it, what will happen? Everyone will believe. It was about the crowds. And the Romans will come and they'll take away both our temple and our nation. The crowds will grow, we'll lose control. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. So from that day on, they began to plot to take his life. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. And they kept looking for Jesus. And as they stood in the temple courts and they asked one another, what do you think? Is he coming to the festival at all? But the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found Jesus there should report it so that they might arrest him. Lord, would you speak to us through your word this morning on this Palm Sunday? We still ourselves before you, Holy Spirit, and we ask for you to move in and around us and through us. Lord, I do not want to be different just because I want to grow. I want to be different because I'm changed by your word. May it change me today. The grass withers and the flower fades, but your word, O Lord, remains. Amen. Touch your neighbor on your way down and say, are you a bad boy today? So here we are. We're in the days and the weeks preceding the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. And the high priest Caiaphas finds his way into our story. Caiaphas. He had an opportunity to stand in the very presence of the Savior of the world. Oh, so many times when I'm praying or just pondering or worshiping or thinking about the Lord, I just think, man, what would it have been like to have actually been there? I mean, come on. That's incredible. And Caiaphas had this opportunity to see it firsthand, to experience his Creator firsthand, to surrender control. He had this opportunity. And it's easy for us to dismiss Caiaphas as a fool. But again, I wonder, are we not also prone to resisting God and putting something else in his place? Something else of our own power, something else of our own control, something else in our life that for us has gained importance beyond where Jesus is in our hearts. Caiaphas had a lot to lose. 4 decades of power in his family. Money, wealth, control. He was saying that this thing that we built, this thing we've maintained, this power, this control that we have, this place where my family has grown to become everything it has become, this is what we control. This is the thing I've gained my identity from. I'm a high priest. My father-in-law was a high priest. This is the thing from which everything out of me flows. This is my whole identity is wrapped up in this. You want me to give this to you, God? I ask you, what's an area of your life that you haven't allowed God to control? Or is there an area of your life where maybe you're gaining identity that isn't flowing from him and who he calls you to be, your identity in him? What is an area where you feel like giving God control of that area will be giving up too much of my life? Giving something up, giving somebody up, giving something that I've worked so hard to obtain or maintain. You see, I'll say it again. Often we resist the God that we claim we trust. There's a little Caiaphas in each of us. We try to preserve whatever it is that we've replaced God with in our lives. For some of us, it's a job. For some of us, it's a relationship. For some of us, it's our plan for our next few years. Cindy and I did not plan to move to 9 Mile Falls. The day we called our real estate agent and said, there's a little house by the hospital. It's got the swimming pool in the backyard we've been looking for. We're going to retire there and be grandma and grandpa. But we had to surrender our plan. And when we don't, what we're saying is this thing that I built, whether it's my plan, my dream, my house, this relationship, this thing in my life, I'm saying that is bigger than you to me, God. And I replace God with that thing. Reputation, relationship, position, beauty, standard of living, whatever it is. While saying yes to God will cost you something, saying no to God will cost you more. We need to remember this, folks. Saying yes to God will cost you something. Oh, but saying no to God will cost you so much more. Yes, we can learn a lot from Caiaphas. What about our second bad boy? Have you ever tried to bargain with God? It's funny, I do this all the time. Lord, if you'd just let me find my keys. Yeah, Kevin once. And he still brought Tracy into your life. Lord, if you just let me find my car keys this morning, I'll whatever, right? Lord, if you'll just heal me. I've been praying for this healing for so long. If you'll just heal me this time, I will, right? We just bargain with God. Lord, I'll give more. I'll start tithing finally. Maybe I'll start helping set up and tear down at the church. If you'll just do this, Lord, I'll do that. God, if you will, I will. Judas Iscariot was a disciple. Judas gets a rap. Oh, come on. He still talk like we talk about all the time. Anything betrays anybody at work, right? They're a Judas. We just call him oh, she's such a Judas. Oh, he is such a Judas. Judas kiss. What we know about Judas is what he was one of the early 12 disciples. When the Gospels recount the early years of Jesus' ministry, and they're talking about the 12 that were with him, Judas was in that group. He was one that Nathanael had sort of invited into the circle. We know that he loved Jesus. We know that he sat at the feet of Jesus during all of Jesus' ministry years. As long as the longest disciples, Judas was there. We know that when Jesus sent out the 12 to preach and teach and do powerful miracles, Judas was one of the ones he sent out, and he was doing them. We know that Jesus trusted Judas enough that he let him do the books and control the money for the way as they were moving from town to town. Judas had a wealthy family and a background with wealth. He was a business owner and had a background in business. He was aware of money and those kind of things, and so Jesus trusted Judas. Matthew 26, 6 through 13 says this. Now, when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment. And she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. We often talk about this, the woman who anointed Jesus with this expensive oil. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? We could have sold that for a large sum and given it to the poor." In fact, if you read John's gospel account of this, what he says is, we all watched this woman anoint Jesus with oil, and Judas got mad. Judas is the one who said, "Why the waste? Why are we wasting this money? We could have given it away to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to him, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done this beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." Again, we're talking about just the days before the Passover. Jesus is trying to hammer the point home to his disciples that, man, you're not getting it. My purpose on this earth is the cross. You will not always have me with you. And they are just hard of hearing. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. They're starting to finally get the message. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. By the way, I just want to stop right here. If you're not always in awe of Jesus already, can we just stop and be in awe of this? Listen to me. The gospel, we call the gospel, we think of that term as a religious term. When we think of the gospel, we think of the story of Christ, the good news. Gospel means good news. But back then, gospel just meant story. It just meant story. When he was saying the gospel, he wasn't saying the journey of me to the cross. He was saying when people share this story, this good news of what this woman has done. Now get this. He is saying to the small group of people who are being burned alive, if they're caught, they're being thrown in jail, this little band of Christians that can't do anything against the massive Roman Empire. He's saying, wherever this gospel is preached, throughout what? They don't even have a concept of world. Their world is like 7 towns. But he is prophesying. He is saying this story is going to get shared throughout the entire world. And every time it does, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Now, he had no idea anybody would be writing this down. But here we are, a couple thousand years later, telling the story about this woman who was faithful. Come on. Can I tell you something? When a man can sit there and say, hey, this thing that's happening right now, somebody's going to write it down, and somebody's going to share it, and then they're going to share it, and then they're going to share it, and they're going to share it. And this is some place called 9 Mile Falls, and someday they're going to hear. And when they hear about it, we are going to honor this woman because of what she did. When a man can do that, when a man can say, I'm going to be moved to my burial, when a man can say, but 3 days later, I'm going to rise again, and then he does it, I don't know about you, but I'm just going with whatever he says from now on. I'm just following that guy. So here we have Judas getting indignant. And by the way, not Judas alone about the waste of money. What's really going on here is Jesus has finally hammered home, I am going to be crucified. I've been telling you this all along, and here we are just in the days. This is about her preparing me for my burial, and you will not have me around any longer. And you know what that's doing? That's telling the disciples, and particularly Judas, who had a very clear vision of what the Messiah would be like, and how he would come on a white horse with a big sword and overtake the Roman Empire. You know, this is what everybody believed. Jesus was going to take over the world. And that's why Judas loved him and committed to him. Judas, by the way, was the only disciple from Judea. Judas knew from his family lineage in Judea that they needed to overthrow the government. And it's finally hitting home to him that this isn't going according to plan. Christ is going to the cross. I love this guy. I've given my life for him. I am following him. Can I tell you something? It says later on that Judas sold out for 30 pieces of silver. Judas was from a wealthy family and controlled all the books. Do you remember when they needed to feed the 5,000, what the disciples said? Let's go into town and buy food for them. Now, I don't know what it would have taken to feed 5,000 people, but if they knew Judas had enough money to go into town and buy food for 5,000 people, Judas didn't need 30 pieces of silver. This was not about selling out because Judas was greedy. Okay? Judas loved Jesus, but Judas was tired. I'm just telling you I'm going to put a little Wayne's opinion in here. And I like to clarify when I'm doing that. Judas saw the outcome of following Jesus going a little differently in his mind. Can I ask you something? How often have you given yourself to the Lord and then just saw the outcome going a little differently in your mind? Lord, I committed to you. I didn't know it was going to look like this. So what does Judas do? This was the last straw. This was his last straw. Judas was disillusioned with Jesus' method. Have you ever been disillusioned with God's way of doing things in your life? Disappointed that his way wasn't your way? So Judas takes matters into his own hand and decides to force it to happen. This is the way it's supposed to happen. So I do this all the time. Just can I tell you something? I feel like this is what happens. I go around in my prayer closet. I always say it this way. And what happens, I really feel like I hear from the Lord. Like God downloads the play. Wayne, when we get back on the field, this is what we're running. And then I go out there and I say hike and I audible. I'm like, okay, Lord, that looks good. But I'm seeing the way things are coming at me. And I'm going to choose to go left instead of right. I got your play, but I'm going to take the ball and I'm going to run with it. And that's what Judas does here. I have done this, my friends, and I'm guessing I'm not alone. Ever been a little disillusioned with what God's plan was for your life after you decided to follow him? I get tired of waiting for God. Jesus is playing the long game, and I have a different view of how this should go in my life. Matthew 26:14-15 says this. Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. I love this because, again, it's about the crowd. What Jesus says is, Judas says to them is, I can get him away from the crowd and let you know when there's not a crowd around, and I can give him over to you. So his plan starts to unfold. Matthew 26:20 says this, when it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12, and as they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And Judas suddenly becomes one of our bad boys. But here's the crux. We think as long as what we're doing is helping God's plan along in our mind, that it's going to be good. Even Judas thought he was helping God's plan along. He thought he was just expediting this coming clash of the titans, if you will, handing Jesus over so we can finally see this final battle between Jesus and Rome. But it didn't play out that way. And Jesus is crucified. And as all of Jesus' teachings play through his head, and Judas recalls every word that he's been hearing the last 2-3 years, how the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. How the last shall be first and the first shall be last. How it must be that I must be about my Father's business. And all of a sudden, Jesus gets crucified and his plans and his words come to life right before Judas's eyes. And what is Judas's response in Matthew 27:3? When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind. He brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. And what do we know about Judas? So full of remorse that he hung himself. Why remorse? Why remorse? If he was just handing Jesus over, he got his silver and it happened. Why remorse? Because he wasn't just handing Jesus over, because he loved Jesus. But he saw it playing out differently. He thought he was setting up the plan that he saw in his mind. And it didn't go that way. He believed in the way. He was just misled about what the way looked like. And he was disillusioned about how Jesus would go about fulfilling his plan. You see, what was such an extraordinary value in 1 minute, that we would choose our own way and betray Jesus, is worth nothing the minute we realize what we gave up for it. I'm going to say that again. And I want you to think about what you've been given 30 pieces of silver for in your life every time you have said, no, I'm going to do this my way and not your way, Jesus. What was of such extraordinary value in 1 minute that we would choose our own way and betray Jesus is worth nothing the minute we realize what we gave up for it. I think about holding on to anger and unforgiveness. And I think, we do those things because emotionally there's a high there. It's a payoff in the short term. Like if I just choose to be mad at you for what you did for me, something inside me feels good about that. It feels right and it feels justified. And when Jesus says, forgive that person, and I say no, Jesus, I love you, and I'm still going to go to church on Sunday, and I'm still going to pray tomorrow. I'm even going to break open the Bible and read it. I'm just going to skip that verse for now because I'm choosing to hold on to this. But that thing that all of a sudden I thought was of such value to make me feel good and justified and right soon becomes something that I just realize is destructive in my own life. And it is worth nothing the second I realize what I could have had in Jesus had I chosen to forgive, or whatever it is for you today. Whatever it is for you, whatever areas of life we're unwilling to let go of, whatever areas of life we're unwilling to trust God's ultimate plan rather than force our plan to work. Let's let go of this picture of how we think things should go and trust God with the outcome. You see, when we surrender to God, he takes responsibility for the outcome of the journey. And oh man, can I tell you something? Holding on to responsibility for the outcome of my journey is a weight that I just don't want to have to carry anymore. But to allow him to have responsibility, to just say, Lord, I'm going to give up my plans for that dream. And by the way, God, I know you love me. And if there was something in my plans or my dream that was like really fulfilling or would have pleased me or would have been good, I'm going to trust that you'll find a way to bless me anyway. Because whatever you have for me must be better than this thing that I think is going to be so good. And I'm going to trust that. There's something in us that wants to leverage God and his power for our own end. We often try to get God to do our thing. We try to bargain with him through prayer, through church attendance, through giving, through short-term obedience. We promise to do what we think he wants us to do so that he'll do what we want him to do. There's a little bit of Judas in me. I think there's a little bit of Judas in all of us. I think we can learn a lot from Judas. Our third bad boy this morning. Have you ever realized that sometimes we tend to think of life as God and God as life? It's kind of hard to delineate life and God and life. We see those two terms synonymous, this relationship between life and God. Let me explain what I mean. If my life is going good, I think God is being good to me. And when my life is not going good, I think, God. This is what God looks like. Why do good things happen to bad people? Why am I sick? Why do I suddenly have this diagnosis? Why is it that my brother-in-law and his family, who don't follow you at all, seem to have everything work out for them, but life is so hard on me? And all of a sudden we begin to equate life with God. And the two terms become synonymous for us. The relationship between life and God. You see, disappointment with life becomes disappointment with God. And here's the danger when we don't separate the two. Our third bad boy is a criminal this morning. He's a criminal that's on the cross. You see, when dreams don't come true, we turn our frustrations toward God. When things don't work out and nothing goes our way and everyone else seems to live their lives and can do whatever they want and get everything they dream of, we turn our frustrations towards God, and it causes us to stop believing and trusting. We don't know everything about the criminal on the cross. In fact, we know very little about him. But we can surmise some things about the fact that he's there. We can surmise a few things. We can surmise that life was not good for him, that he's hanging next to another criminal, and the two of them are hanging next to Jesus. We can surmise he must have been a really bad man. I mean, he must have been a really bad man, bad enough to be thrown and tortured into a Roman prison. Bad enough that whereas most prisoners just became slaves, they deemed this one so bad that we won't even make him an indentured servant. We need to actually just get rid of him altogether. That's how bad he is. That he's going to endure the worst torture known to humankind. That's how bad he is. We know his life was hard and it was rough, and it must have been a complete disappointment. Difficult times must have brought bad decisions, and bad decisions brought him here in this Roman prison, and the worst of decisions brought him from the prison to the cross. All those characteristics he likely shared with the other criminal on the scene. But the two take a very different approach as they encounter Christ. Luke 23:33 says this: when they came to this place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with two criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Two criminals, two stories, two lives very, very disappointing. Two opportunities to experience Christ. Luke 23:34 says this: Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." They see Christ in between them. And what is his response to the people who are crucifying him? Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. That's a whole series of messages all by itself. But I just want you to imagine you're one of the criminals watching Jesus go through what you're going through, knowing you deserve it and he doesn't. He's done nothing and had nothing like the life you've had. And you're angry and bitter and shouting and doing everything you can to think of to get yourself off this cross. And he is giving himself to the process and choosing to forgive. Jesus' words catch one of those criminals off guard. This man who deserves nothing is being beaten down, mocked, and killed, and he chooses forgiveness? His life ends up like this, and yet he is still following God's way? Really? And the other criminal joins in the mocking. He hurls insults at Jesus. If you're really the Christ, lower yourself down from the cross. And he mocks Jesus, and he spits towards Jesus. And he's just taking his own mountain of pain and life disappointments and his own mountain of futility and his own mountain of hurting, all of this stuff, and just hurls it at Jesus. But not the first criminal. His response is completely different. In Luke 23:40-41, Luke records it like this: when he heard the first criminal mocking Jesus, he says to him, but the criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God?" he said. "Since you and I are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." It's hit him. He's watching Jesus and it's hit him. My life may have not turned out how I wanted, but that's not an indictment on God. One criminal sees life and God the same. My life turned out this way, so you must be a jerk, and I wish we would all die. One criminal says, my life turned out this way, but I deserved it. And that's not an indictment on God. That realization that he can separate life from God. He chooses a different response. Luke 23:42 says this: then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." It's really 6 simple words, but there's so much truth and power packed into them. Life happens, and God can be trusted. The two they go together. They can happen at the same time. Life can happen. All the good, the bad, the indifferent, the disappointments, and all this stuff. And God can still be good and can still be trusted. Life happens and God can be trusted. When do you think we're tempted to assume God should make our lives easy just because we give them to him? Jesus was God, and was his life easy? I mean, come on, but we make this assumption that because I turned my life over to you, Jesus, somehow that means it's going to be all rainbows and ponies and unicorns and fuzzies and pink sweaters and bunny rabbits. I don't know where all that stuff just came from. 2 granddaughters, probably. God used the injustice experienced by Jesus to bring salvation to mankind. If you choose to trust him, God can bring good from what life has thrown at you as well. Are there circumstances in your life right now that you need to surrender to God and say out loud as a reminder to your own spirit, my life right now is hard, but God is good. Life happens, and God can be trusted. As long as your fists are clenched, you can't receive from him what you need most. And God will not force on you what you're willing to receive, what you aren't willing to receive. But when you open your hands and surrender, and instead of clenching your fists in anger, you're a candidate for his life-giving grace and mercy. You're a candidate for life-defining moments of your story in Jesus. When you throw up your hands and surrender, you may discover answers to questions that you have tried to control yourself for years. Last week we talked in our meeting about attending to the presence of God. You remember that? We talked about we've got to pay attention. We've got to attend to his presence. Because when we do that, when we choose to be aware of his presence, what happens? We've decided that what you choose to be aware of shapes your reality. What you choose to be aware of shapes your reality. So we need to be more aware of the presence of God in our life. So I ask you this week. We may be a little more like these bad boys than we care to admit. Will this shape your reality? Saying yes to God will cost you something. Saying no will cost you more. In what areas are you still saying no to God? Would you stand with me, church? I want to pray. I'm going to ask our prayer team to come forward. We're going to have people up front to pray. We're going to have people in the back, if you'd rather just wander back that way, to pray. But I'm encouraging you this morning, if the Lord has just prompted or pricked your heart in any one area, man, just allow your brothers and sisters to pray for you. What area of your life are you still saying no to God? When we put aside our agenda and surrender to God, he takes responsibility for the outcome of our journey. So I ask you, in what areas are you struggling to surrender control? Life happens and God can be trusted, and the two are not always synonymous. So in what areas are you allowing the disappointments of your life to affect your ability to trust God? Would you pray with me?